The first of the US races this year has come and gone. It was a sprint weekend again. We saw some changeable conditions in some sessions, and I think it was one of the more interesting races so far on the calendar. It's the 2025 Miami Grand Prix. Let's get on into it. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're here to talk about what happened this weekend in Miami for the F1 weekend. It was a weekend fraught with rain, potential rain, drama, and carnage up and down the grid, and ultimately coming together for an interesting race on Sunday. We're going to go over our quick hits. We're going to talk about our weekend winners and losers, and then we will actually end up talking about the week that I think might have yielded the most amount of points scored across our whole community in terms of our predictions results. Let's go ahead and jump on into our quick hits, but before we do, if you have not already, subscribe down below. We'd love to have you join our little community here as we continue to talk about Formula One racing and sim racing all in all. Let me know in the comment section down below what rating you would give the Miami Grand Prix weekend out of 10, and then we'll wrap things up. As always, if you make it and you enjoy any part of the video, leave a thumbs up. It really helps me out. But let's go ahead, without further ado, let's jump on into it and get this party started with our weekend quick hits. I think we'll kick off our quick hit section by talking about something that seems interesting on the surface, but it really depends on how deep we want to go with it. And it's a question that I've been asking myself since last year when it became a sprint race weekend for the first time. And that is Miami conducive to decent racing? At least we'll go with decent, because I think this weekend was a good microcosm of what this weekend could look like in terms of, you know, the ideal weekend. Over the sprint race, we saw changeable conditions. In the main Grand Prix, we actually saw some very close racing and some interesting moves and moments and a lot of prolonged battles between individual cars. But at the same time, it kind of also sort of, you know, developed into a watch timing tower watching simulator, and really just looking for the moments here or there that you might see something happen. So it's a very interesting one, right, where the sprint race weekend provides an opportunity for some short practice sessions and less practice time rather, and then just jump right into sessions. You throw in the fact that Miami weather is always changing, like we saw this weekend, and you really are just left with a lot of question marks and the potential for drama. And if it comes in a la the sprint race, I think you have a very interesting session that yields a lot of very interesting results. And I really just, you leave it going, wow, what a weirdly good, you know, race session. But then you get to the Grand Prix, and after the first 25 laps, so basically like right after the midway point, after the pit stops, it kind of settled into, you know, gaps being 1, 2, 3+ seconds, and you kind of were just waiting around to see if someone's tires would fall off faster than others, and ultimately you know, have a moment where your biggest watching point is Lando going to be able to close down a like 6-second gap over the course of the final few laps. So it's one of those interesting ones, but at the same time, this is the second year in a row that I'm leaving Miami asking this question more so than it was in 2022 or 2023. What do you think? Let's go ahead, we'll touch a little bit more on the sprint race. I kind of hit the highlights of it, honestly. This was a race that started in a monsoon. We got a few formation laps, which technically then transitioned into race laps. And ultimately, out of the 18 total laps, the first 10 or so race laps were kind of ho-hum. It is what it is. We did see a surprise pole sitter in the sprint race with Kimi Antonelli, and so that was a very positive thing that we saw going into the sprint weekend itself. Unfortunately for Kimi, I think he just did not get the start that he needed to in the sprint race, ended up falling down the order and fell, you know, victim to some carnage later on. But at the same time, it wasn't really until the second half where we really started to transition into those, you know, drier conditions, and you start seeing different drivers make, you know, the bold call for pit stops, getting onto slick tires and trying to make something happen from there. It really worked out for Lewis Hamilton, who ended up on the sprint podium, and others I think could have seen it work for them, but unfortunately we also had accidents carnage, which ultimately kind of nullified it all in the end. Lando ends up inheriting the win from Oscar, who had done very, very well up to that point, and so he ultimately comes home for a Lando win in this sprint race. And so the sprint race, I think, had a little bit of everything, and it really kind of came down to that last little bit, the contact and issues with Liam Lawson and Fernando Alonso, that kind of sealed it for Lando. Elsewhere in that race, we also saw a very detrimental penalty to Max Verstappen, who was given an unsafe release 10-second penalty, where he was released from his pit box into the path of Kimi Antonelli. They ended up coming together, and unfortunately that also ruins Kimi's race as well. Otherwhere on the grid, we saw a lot of people end up with post-race penalties, ended up knocking them down the order. Ollie Behrman, who had started basically at the back, ultimately made his way up to finish P8, but an unsafe release for him ultimately pushed him out of the points as well. And Liam Lawson, another very similar situation where his contact ran with Fernando and gave him a 5-second penalty as well. And the fact that we finished behind the safety car means that they effectively finished last. So a bit unfortunate for those guys. It was a wild sprint race, and it just really set the tone for you don't really know what's going to happen on the Grand Prix on Sunday. Moving on to the Grand Prix on Sunday, we have to talk about whether or not Oscar Piastri dominance might delight fans. Oscar once again comes out to win his third Grand Prix in a row, if my math is correct, winning the Miami Grand Prix itself after getting past Max Verstappen early on and ultimately driving away into the distance, holding off his eventual charge from his teammate Lando Norris in this one. But Lando not able to do so. He ended up being stuck behind Max for a little longer than he probably would have liked to, ultimately finishing P2, which is a very solid result for him. But considering that it was, I believe, Max starting on pole, Lando starting next to him with Kimi in P3, and then Oscar P4, we saw a very feisty start, we'll put it that way, before ultimately settling into a Max P1, Oscar P2, and Lando falling down the order all the way to 6th place. And so it was a tough battle back for Lando. I think definitely still had the pace to challenge for a win if he had been more decisive in his moves on Max and got around him. But by the time he did get around Max, it was all basically over at that point, because there has about an 8 or 9 second gap to P1 to Oscar. So Oscar walking away with the championship at this point. I think he now leads by 16 points. So definitely still a long way to go, but considering where we were not but 5 races ago, I think we're starting to see the cream separate themselves from the crop, and Oscar is walking away with it to a bit. Next thing I want to talk about is Kimi Antonelli and how unlucky he is over the course of this weekend. I think it's kind of the microcosm of the Kimi Antonelli experience that we got last year after it was announced that he would be taking over for the departing Lewis Hamilton. He took part in the FP1 session at Monza, where we saw him put in 90% of a dominant, blistering lap before ultimately crashing out at the end. So it just seems like one of those instances where you saw a lot of the good with the bad, and I think it's a good sign for the future. But at the same time, to start on sprint pole and ultimately falling back due to the contact with Max, and then ultimately at the beginning of the Grand Prix to qualify third, make your way up to battling Max for the lead, before ultimately just not necessarily having the pace full on and falling back down the order and finishing behind your teammate, who also then finished on the podium. Very unlucky for Kimi, but as time goes on, I think we'll see this from him more, and I definitely am expecting to see Kimi's name at the more towards the sharp end of the leaderboard more often than not. Let's briefly touch on Williams having another fantastic race. I think Carlos was unlucky to get stuck behind the 2 Ferraris there at the end, but Alex Albon with another absolutely fantastic weekend from him. And Williams, I think, is starting to force us to ask some questions as we continue moving onward. Speaking of Sainz and his battle with the Ferraris, I think we have to talk about the sassiest Lewis Hamilton I think I've ever seen this weekend, and those few laps where he was going back and forth with his race engineer and Ferrari, trying to get past Charles Leclerc to really give it a chance to try and chase down Kimi Antonelli, and ultimately resulting in one of the sassiest radio message I think I've ever heard from Lewis, when after swapping back with Charles there towards the end, and they inform him that the gap to Sainz behind was 1.4 seconds, he responds with, "Do you want me to let him pass too?" What a diva, and what an absolutely fantastic radio message towards the end of this one. It provided everyone a good giggle, and a lot of people really enjoyed it, me included. And I think we can wrap the quick hits up, I think, with a sentiment that I think also I kind of touched on in the beginning, which is just sort of the whole Miami experience, which was this probably the most competitive, uncompetitive race that we've ever seen in Miami. because at the beginning of the race, for the entire first half of the race, there was action all the way up and down the field, and there was a lot of drama going on at the front, with Oscar trying to get by Max, and then Lando trying to get by Max, and then even towards the midpoint of the race, you had different drivers trying to make it work and trying to get around each other to no avail. We saw some really good defending in this one, and I think it was a lot of fun to watch. But ultimately, the race did kind of settle in, where if you looked at the timing tower, there was a lot of gap of 1, 2, 3+ seconds, basically in every slot. And so ultimately, it did kind of become a pretty uncompetitive race. Oscar managing way at the front. Lando also moving on to the point of over 30+ seconds ahead of George Russell, who finished in P3. There was an opportunity for Max to try and chase down George at the end, but his tires kind of gave out towards the final few laps. I think the closest thing that we really had to a battle was on the final corner. Effectively, you saw a dive bomb from Carlos Sainz into Lewis Hamilton, trying to get that position finally, before ultimately not necessarily being able to make the moves, stick. I don't think I saw anything come from that by the time I've recorded this, so hopefully if I remember, or if not, we'll see. It was going to be investigated after the session. We'll see if I get this right or not after it's uploaded, so fingers crossed. And then we'll actually end on this one. The Lego F1 car race should come back for every weekend. All of the drivers talked about how much they enjoyed it, and it was so much fun to watch that I definitely think they should bring them back again. So Lego F1, make it happen. I would love to see it. All right, let's move on now to our weekend winners and losers. And this one actually, I think, was a little tougher to come up with than I think it realistically could have been. There's a lot of interesting moments. We'll begin with our our weekend winner, which I think was a little more cut and dry, at least in terms of my opinion. I briefly debated on Oscar Piastri, continuing to string together wins, starting on 4th, finishing 1st, extending his championship lead to 16 points over Lando. But ultimately, I'm going to go with Alex Albon in this one. I also debated on going with Williams, but if Carlos had finished closer to Alex, I think that would have been a no-brainer. But we're going with Alex Albon for the simple fact that this is once again another weekend where Alex has just put in an absolutely perfect performance in that Williams car, and I think it's about time we start having conversations on whether or not Williams has a car that is in contention for a top 4 car on the grid. That's all I'm gonna say. I'm gonna leave it there. What do you think? Let me know down in the comment section below. On the other side, weekend loser I think was a little less obvious even than the weekend winner. I briefly debated on trying to do like the rookies in general. There was a lot of moments over the course of the weekend that had some really down moments for the rookies. Obviously in the sprint race you had Fernando Alonso and Liam Lawson coming together, and then in the also in the sprint race, the Ollie Bearman getting the penalty to push him out of the points. And then in the main Grand Prix, you had Ollie Bearman once again, who his engine decided to give up part of the way through, doing and Liam Lawson contact at the beginning of the race, which ultimately led to both of their DNFs. Gabriel Bortoleto, also his engine going, or some mechanical DNF from him. And then Kimi Antonelli, we had also touched on the issues that he had over the course of the weekend. So I really debated on going with the rookies, but while I'll use this as a special, honorable mention for weekend loser, I am going to narrow it down to just be Kimi Antonelli in this one, mainly because I think we saw someone who's rose to such high highs and unfortunately just fell back for almost no fault of his own, just back into the lows that we had seen him kind of finishing behind George. And I think this was a weekend where I think you saw the potential for what Kimi could bring to Mercedes, but ultimately it just wasn't to be after it was all said and done. Taking sprint pole, really challenging at the front, but ultimately finishing with the contact with Max like we mentioned, and finishing effectively way down the order behind George once again. And then in the Grand Prix, qualifying very, very well ahead of George again, challenging for the lead at one point before ultimately falling back down the order, just due to, it seems like Mercedes' race pace over the full Grand Prix just definitely seemed a bit lacking. I know George finished on the podium, but I think that just happens to be more from George's probably experience more than anything. So I'm going with Kimi Antonelli, although there is definitely an argument to be made about the rookies as a whole being our weekend losers. All right, one section remains, our predictions results. And if you are unaware, these are the predictions we make before the Grand Prix weekend rolls around. Me and my community make our predictions in our Discord, link down below, before the weekend begins, and we'll add up the totals as the weekend is over, and we'll see who over the course of this season can chef the most, get in the kitchen, and cook up some fire predictions. Let's go over the predictions we made at the beginning of the Grand Prix weekend. Let's start with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went with Lewis Hamilton, and I thought I was absolutely cooking with this one because not only did Lewis make the brilliant decision to switch onto the slicks in the sprint race, I think we saw that he could have been on one of the more preferred strategies in the Grand Prix itself, but an unfortunate Q2 exit in qualifying put him behind, put him on his back foot, and ultimately kind of just fell right where you kind of expect Ferrari to be at this point. Ferrari also did definitely not look particularly quick this weekend as well. And so it was just one of those weekends where you saw the potential, but at the same time, you also saw very much the depths that Ferrari have fallen into. So no point for me on that one. As we move on to my pick for biggest disappointment, I went with Liam Lawson. And that's a ding ding if I've ever heard of one, because not only did he fall all the way down the order from his penalty in the sprint race of crashing out Fernando Alonso, he also has contact with Jack Doohan, ultimately causing him to DNF. And I don't even know if he technically classified. He finished 19th, mainly just because he was one of the next ones to, or 18th. I can't remember if he or Bortoleto DNF before him. Man, the rookies had a tough weekend. But ultimately, Liam Lawson DNFs from the Miami Grand Prix, so I'm taking that point whatsoever with no comments, questions, or concerns from anyone else. As we move on to our qualifying top three, this was the qualifying for the main Grand Prix on Sunday after it took place after the sprint race. I had an Oscar Piastri pole position, a Max Verstappen P2, and a Lando Norris P3. Obviously, Max ended up taking pole position. Lando ended up coming home in P2, and Oscar unfortunately was hit by Kimi Antonelli in qualifying. So all in all, it was only a single point added up over the course of the whole qualifying, with half point from Max and a half point from Lando. So not too bad, but the potential was there. As we move on now to sprint winner. And this was one I nailed thanks to the safety car in the sprint race, allowing Lando Norris to get a free pit stop. And ultimately, Lando benefits once again from a safety car. And this time, I benefit along with him because I had Lando Norris winning the sprint race. So another point for me. As we move on now to our race podium. Once again, our Grand Prix podium that happened today. I had an Oscar Piastri win, a Lando Norris P2, and a Max Verstappen P3, which I think could have happened if one small tweak here or there could have gone better and more in my way. So he was trying to chase down George at the end, but unfortunately no for Max. So I'll get 2 points for my race podium. And then we'll wrap things up with my one crazy prediction, which was a Jack Doohan scores his first points of the season. No, he did not, and we will not stick around too much on that because not only did he struggle in the sprint race, he DNF'd on lap 1 of the Grand Prix, and I knew I had a 0 on that one basically the second the race started. So unfortunate to say the least. Maybe I got a little too ahead of myself, but at the same time, I think I've had my best weekend of the season to date and my first best weekend in a very long time if we extend it back to last season as well. So I finish up with 5 points for the weekend, absolutely chefing, which should have vaulted me ever closer to the elusive P1. But alas, a lot of my community absolutely cooked this weekend and absolutely cooked it. Let me see. I'll just go down the number of points scored. 5 points, 1.5, 6.5 points, which I believe is the new record for most points in a single weekend. I'm going to have to do the math. I believe the maximum amount of points you can get is on a sprint weekend. Yeah, biggest positive surprise, biggest disappointment, qualifying, top 3, sprint winner, podium, and then one crazy prediction. So out of a maximum of 10, we got 6.5. So pretty good if you really think of it. 4.5, 4, and 4.5. So my 5 points, very solid. Unfortunately, didn't even win the weekend. So that's pretty cool. But as we look out at our points total after the weekend is over, we currently have Sentinel 40 who is vaulted into the lead with 22.5 points. We have F1 Inferno on 22 points. Me hot on their heels in P3 in 21.5 points. We have British TTG with 19 points. Andrew with 14, and then Spectral, who makes their return this weekend and is now on 9 points. So a very, very fun weekend to say the least. A lot of people were very good in predictions, and I'm going to have to keep this energy if I'm going to try and catch up. So I think I went from P3 to P3, even after scoring 5 points. So a tough weekend for me. But guys, that only leaves one question remaining. What is next in Formula One? We have another week off as F1 heads back to Italy. It is the Imola, or sorry, let me try to remember. No, it's the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix held in Imola. I'm very excited. I love Imola. I don't know if it's necessarily conducive for racing with these current era of F1 cars, but I like Imola. It's really a track that really separates the drivers from each other the most, and so I, for one, cannot wait to see. Last year, it was a Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc podium. Who will we see on the podium this year in 2 weeks' time when F1 returns? I hope you enjoyed the Miami Grand Prix weekend. I know I did. It's going to be a long wait once again. After having a doubleheader into a triple header, having the single standard weekend split by a week off in either end doesn't feel as good anymore. I'm sure the teams are excited for another week off, but I already cannot wait for F1 to be back. What would you give the Miami Grand Prix weekend out of 10? Let me know down in the comment section below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you made it this far into the video, go ahead, leave a like rating. It will really help me out, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you are, man, Imola cannot come soon enough. I know I will always advocate for the team's behalf, but I already cannot wait for F1 to be back once again. I think this season is going to heat up even more with the fights that we've been seeing at the front. I cannot wait. But guys, unfortunately, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.